All right, very glad to have our next guest. I saw him speak at a church. You know what? We'll keep it nameless because I don't want to be a liability to any church. Where if they find out that I am in attendance,
all the churches.
Yeah, the next time the pastor will be, get him. So, but I read the book. I highly recommend it. It is Martin Luther, the man who rediscovered God and changed the world. He is the host, the author of this book, also of the Eric Metaxas Show. Spoiler alert: you can go to metaxastalk.com or follow him on the Twitter, Eric Metaxas, no underscore. I always have to make sure I look down to get that right. Mr. Metaxas, thank you for being here, sir.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me well?
No, we can hear you well. We can see you well. You look like Harry Potter stayed in shape, and this is like the sequels. Yeah, aged gracefully.
I don't know what that means, but thank you.
Well, it's a compliment, and I have a wife somewhere around who's watching in the green room, going, "Yes, she's the biggest Harry Potter fan who exists." Let me kind of lead this off with. I know you've written so many books, and I highly recommend people check out your show, if only just from a historical perspective. I know how much you research them, but this one is particularly fascinating. We had I think Alec Ryrie on the show, who talked about Martin Luther, the man who made the modern world. But let me ask you this, from a historical perspective, and you read about this in the book, even with secular types, what kind of impact did Martin Luther have? Why does he still matter, in today's sort of social, cultural sphere?
That's why I wrote the book. I became convinced. My friend Greg Thornbury, former president of the King's College, started bugging me a few years ago. So the 500th anniversary of the Reformation is coming up. You, Eric, need to write the biography of Martin Luther. And I said, why? And he basically made me understand that, the reason I say why is because writing a biography is, it's hard work.
Right.
And I need to convince the subject is worthy of all that time. My time is really precious. And he made me understand that Luther was so influential that when you really look into it, you go a little crazy because you realize what I realized. Let me put it this way. My conclusion in writing the book is that he is literally the most influential human being in the last 2,000 years, apart from Jesus of Nazareth. Some of you have probably heard of him. But I got to tell you, that's not hyperbole. Luther did not set out to be influential, but he stands on the stage of world history absolutely alone. What he did 500 years ago, exactly 500 years ago, changed the world and created the modern world in which we live, so that almost everything we take for granted, the things that we assume about modern life, whether it's self-government and freedom, the concept of freedom, the concept of the individual, the concept of speaking truth to power, the concept that there could be truth apart from power, that the power, that whether it's the church or the state, they don't tell us what is true. There is truth apart from the state. Sometimes the state can get it wrong. Sometimes the church can get it wrong. This is just mind-blowing, history exploding stuff. And when I discovered that and wrote about him, I said there's just nobody who can be next to him. And I would also add, he's an incredibly entertaining subject. The Bonhoeffer book, it's inspiring, my previous book, but it's difficult. Luther is hilarious. There's so much about him that's so funny that I just thought I want to write about this guy.
Well, that brings me to my follow-up question, because obviously you just made some claims which some people go, whoa, hold on there, Chief. Divisive figure.
Yeah, those people are wrong, but go ahead.
Okay. Divisive figure, especially we have a lot of Catholic viewers. Why? So before I move on to the next question, so I'd like to know kind of some of the folklores and myths that you address in your book that aren't necessarily true. But before we get there, since you just talked about that, why would you presuppose, and what would you say to someone who goes, well, hold on a second, more influence in the people who maintained the Bible through the Dark Ages, more important or influential than the original church before Martin Luther? Why is he more important than the...
Oh, no. I'm not saying he's more influential than the church. What I'm really saying is that as an individual, as a figure in history, nobody is more influential. I didn't say nobody is better. I just said more influential. I mean, what Luther did, he did many things that I would consider great and important, and he did many things which predictably were disastrous. I think that we have to be honest. I mean, also there's the issue of anti-Semitism late in his career. I'm not saying he's the greatest man who ever lived.
Sure.
What I am saying is that he's, historically speaking, in terms of where we are in history today, Luther was the most influential. Just take the issue of today we value in America, okay, we understand that you cannot have self-government and American-style freedom without separation of church and state. The state cannot tell us what to believe, how to worship. The founders understood this profoundly, and yet they never could have understood this without Luther, because before the founders, you have a history of the church and the state being one, okay? So in Luther's day, just imagine you have the Holy Roman Empire. They are basically saying there is one church. And if you want to live anywhere in Europe, you must belong to this church. You must do what the church tells you. And by the way, if you don't, the state will enforce it.
Right.
So in terms of freedom, there was no freedom. Now, if you're a Catholic, you say, well, that was a good thing. Well, in some ways, as a Christian, I see it as a good thing. But it ended up ultimately being, it's kind of like saying, I kept my kids in the house so that nobody could hurt them. Well, at some point, they have to grow up. They have to learn how to go out of the house, and they have to learn how to be safe outside the house. So if you keep people in this perpetual state of childhood, there's something fundamentally sick about it. And human beings, as we all know, ultimately want to be free. God wants us to be free. So that wasn't even a possibility until Luther confronted the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church at the time, it wasn't just the Catholic Church, it was the state, it was the empire. They were basically saying, anything you have to say that differs from us, we're not interested, we will crush you.
And by the way, that existed after Luther as well. You know, a lot of people are confused when I tell them in Quebec, I went to public school. I say, okay, I say I went to Catholic school. They go, hold on a second. You say, no, they're one and the same. Public schools were Catholic schools. I was sent down to the office regularly. This is not necessarily a very unique thing that only Martin Luther encountered. If you look at Europe, anywhere the Catholic state has existed, there also tends to be a rejection of faith. That's the difference between allowing a freedom of exercising your faith versus enforcing it.
Thank you.
And
you must be Stephen Crowder because you understand this.
Well, no,
let me tell you. Let's not beat up on the Catholic Church. The same is true in any Protestant state-led. When you have a state and a church in the Protestant mold, Henry VIII was guilty of this. King James I, the King James Bible, he was destroying the lives of the Puritans. These were men and women of God who said, we think a little differently than the Church of England. And he said, we'll crush you. He persecuted them horribly, put them in prison. It was a nightmare. The same thing happens in the Eastern Orthodox world. Go to Russia today and try to preach the gospel of Jesus along evangelical lines and see what Putin's government will do to you. They say, no, there's only one church here, the Russian Orthodox Church. So this is an issue that follows us to this day. And only in America have we really did we achieve freedom early on, 240 years ago, that basically said it's healthy and right for people to be able to choose what they believe.
Well, we could talk for an hour just about Russia because they effectively, they exchanged cultural atheism and Marxism for religious legalism. It's just another device really to control the people. When people go, hold on, so let's not use it as an example of the church, okay? We're talking about ex-KGB enforcing this. But let me get to this. I always find it really interesting. You talked about this at church when I saw you speak. A tidbit about Martin Luther, the famous hymn pinning on the bulletin board, in front of the church, pinning it right in the door of the church. Sorry, I just spoiled it by using a word because it's now in my head after reading the book.
No.
Explain some of the misconceptions that are constantly getting around with Martin Luther.
The more famous somebody is, the more legends are going to develop around them, right? We all know that Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church. He was sticking his finger in the eye of the Pope by nailing these theses to the door of the church. And he was causing trouble, and he was a hero. And we've seen the illustrations, we've seen the paintings of this famous moment of Luther on October 31st, 1517, 500 years ago, doing this great thing. And then when you do the research, as I did, you realize, well, that's not exactly right. First of all, what Luther was doing was a very humble act. He wasn't trying to be anti-church. He was basically saying that as a humble son of the church, as a monk who loves his church, loves it so much that he doesn't want it ever to go astray, he sees a problem with indulgences. And he says, what's the proper process? I'm not going to go against the Pope. On the contrary, we're going to convene some theologians to have a theological debate. It will be held in Latin here in Wittenberg. And so he said, what do you do? So you post 95 debate points someplace in Latin, and you put it on the local bulletin board, and then theologians say, oh, there's a debate on indulgences. They get together, and maybe they'll move the ball forward a little bit, and the church will take notice. This is all within the system. This is exactly what you're supposed to do, except where was the local bulletin board? I mean, if you were missing a cat or you wanted to give guitar lessons, where do you post the notice?
Right.
The local bulletin board in that day was the gigantic wooden doors of the Castle Church. So by posting it on the wooden door of the castle church. It was the equivalent of putting it, on the bulletin board next to the laundry room. There was no crazy idea here.
Right.
He was just putting it where people read notices. Secondly, we don't even know that he did it on October 31st. In fact, he probably didn't. We know that he mailed a letter to the Archbishop of Mainz. That was like this dispositive moment that triggered everything. But the actual nailing of the theses to the door, not only don't we know that he did it October 31st, he probably didn't, we don't even know that he nailed the theses. He might have used paste. We know he didn't use a staple gun or push pins, but he may have used paste, and he also may well have given the document to the church custodian who would have posted these things. So this image, this venerable image that's etched, in the minds of everybody who pays attention to history, it's one of those images. It's not really a false image, but it kind of leads us to the false conclusion that he was taking a stand, and by using a hammer, he's thundering against the papacy. That's not right.
Well, and I think it does a great disservice to, like you said, how humble Martin Luther actually was. It makes him seem more bombastic, like he came in looking to just pick a fight, which isn't what he was doing. He was looking to have a dialogue, even though he thought they were wrong. I do wonder if there were social justice warriors at the church. Keep your debate terms off this chapel back then. Which brings me to my. We don't have a ton of time. I could go on forever. We'll love to have you back. To my final question: what was Martin Luther's fundamental goal for the gospel, for the church? That's something that we just kind of got into a micro example, but is often misconstrued.
You really are going to have me back, because these are big. You're asking some big questions here. I thought this was going to be like true or false questions.
Scantron with the number 2 pencil. Yeah, we'll do that next time.
Thank you. Yes. Luther really wanted nothing more than, well, actually, let's go backwards. Even before he knew what he wanted, he was a monk. He was obsessed with his own salvation. He was obsessed with not going to hell. That's really the bigger picture, is that medieval Catholicism had become effectively, practically speaking, works-based. In other words, even though they knew that Jesus died on the cross to pay for our sins, to open the door to heaven, they focused on what we have to do so much that you got the impression that unless you do all these things, and unless you confess every sin and do everything perfectly, you're going to go to hell for eternity. So it became profoundly fear-based.
Right.
Luther, being kind of OCD, he really was driving himself out of his mind trying to do everything right. And when you try to do everything right really, really, really well, you realize, I can't do it.
Right.
And Luther realized he couldn't do it. And that's when in the Bible, he kind of discovers this idea, which had not been popular at the time, that, by the way, we're saved by faith, not by what we do. It's clear as a bell. There are all these different scriptures. So he kind of discovers this, and it's as if you're a whistleblower at Exxon and you're a nobody, and you discover this thing and you're saying, the reason we're losing money, billions of dollars, is because we're getting this thing wrong. Why don't I take it up the chain of command? And of course, they'll thank me and give me a medal and a promotion for letting them know that they're screwing this up. And you go up the chain of command, and what they basically tell you is, excuse me, shut up and go away. And if you don't shut up, we will crush you. Right. So Luther has this, he finds, in a sense, the theological core. He finds what has been screwing everything up and has been driving people into this false religion, into this pro forma, kind of ritualistic religion. And he says, this is what the Bible says. But the temerity that it would take to speak this to the Pope, and they basically said, look, we're not interested. You're a young monk, not also a young punk, but a monk. You have nothing to teach us. We are the Pope. We are the papacy. And so what he really wanted at this point was for the truth to get out, but he didn't want it to get out outside of the Catholic Church. He said, no, we want to be reformed from within.
Right.
But it was only when they excommunicated him and treated him extremely poorly. It's actually very sad that he was forced outside the church, and then he became the maniac that we kind of know. Some people celebrate, some people revile. But he really wanted the truth about the good news of Jesus Christ to get out to the whole world. And he said that's not happening.
Right. And that's what I think is so telling about this book. Again, the book is Martin Luther, the Man Who Rediscovered God and Changed the World by Eric Metaxas. Before we go, the analogy that I use is it's like wanting to act as a consultant to improve your business, to optimize it. That's what he wanted to do versus start a competing business. He didn't want to start Pepsi. He just wanted a Coke to go back to its original formula when they had gone on to new Coke, and it wasn't doing all that well.
It's what?
Actually,
a pretty good analogy.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. This guy's a professional professional, but you can go listen to him. Of course, he has a show at metaxastalk.com. I highly recommend the book. I very much enjoyed it when you spoke at the church, which shall remain nameless. Eric Metaxas, let's have you back soon to go through this more. I really appreciate it, brother.
Anytime. I appreciate you. Thank you.
There, oh, hold on, there's music. He can't. Will he dance? I don't think he's going to dance. I don't know.